I'm going to get us started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Grossman, and I direct the CBC Training Institute. Today, we are here with Dr. Norman Blumenthal of OHEL, who is going to do a wonderful presentation for us on grief and loss. But before we get started, I just want to give you a little orientation to the webinar format that we're using today, just to answer some of your questions. So you will notice that we're on Zoom today. All participants were placed on mute when you joined the webinar in order to avoid distracting background noises during today's presentation. You can't unmute yourself, but if you would like to ask a question, please write it in the chat box and please chat to everyone. You should see a chat icon on the bottom of your screen, but if you don't see it, look on the right side and click where there's a speech bubble and the chat box should pop up on the right. If you experience any technical difficulties or issues with your connection during today's webinar, please chat to the host and they will assist you. And we are here also with Tara Reddy of McSilver Institute, who is doing our admin for today. And we're very, very lucky to have her as well. I want to give you a little orientation to CBC before we go forward. So we can go to the next slide. Before we start, I really want to thank SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is a grant that we have been given via SAMHSA to provide you all free training on self-care in different ways. And please stay tuned. We have sent out February's list of trainings as well. So if you would like any of that, I'll put my email in the chat box and you can get information on that. We can go to the next slide. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about coordinated behavioral care. We're a not-for-profit organization dedicated to improving the quality of care for New Yorkers with serious mental illness, chronic health conditions, and/or substance use disorders through a health home and independent practice association and other innovative programs such as preventative case management services. And we really seek to create a healthcare environment where New Yorkers, especially those most impacted by social determinants of health, receive coordinated, individualized, and culturally competent community-based care that's effective in preventing and managing chronic physical and behavioral health conditions. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I also wanted to tell you a little bit about CBC and our training institute that collaborated today with OHEL to bring you this free training. You'll see that big paragraph is our mission statement. I'll let you read that. But you can see some of the trainings that we've offered at different times. Here are some of them: supporting LGBTQIA+ clients, HIPAA and working from home. We had an anti-racism training, working with clients with borderline personality disorder. So a variety of different trainings that we offer as the Training Institute. But this series, again, is just specifically on self-care. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Norman Blumenthal and of OHEL, and I am going to put my information in the chat box so that if you would like to be added to our list for the Training Institute, you can let me know. Okay, I'll turn it over to Dr. Norman Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Emily. And good morning to everybody. I hope everyone is well and everyone's loved ones are well. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you for about the next hour and a half. The topic is grief and loss. What I would like to do is first begin by thanking Emily Grossman and Tara Reddy for their help in putting this together, and of course CBC, which is an agency well worth knowing for all the great work that they do. I will tell you a little bit about, I should also, by the way, thank my colleagues at OHEL, Tsevi Ryder, Laura Bart, along with our CEO, David Mendel, and Presidium, Melzachter, and Jay Kestenbaum, who really make it possible for all of us in the agency to do this kind of work and to share our knowledge with others. I'm having the screen here, the topics that I'm going to be covering beforehand. Let me just sort of introduce myself, and not introduce myself in terms of credentials, but tell you the story. I think it's very worth knowing how I got involved in this rather depressing topic. One of the things I often say is that this is the reason why I don't get invited to parties, because people ask me what I do for a living and the party's over. But it's really not that depressing or despondent. We see a lot of strength and see a lot of unity and care. But it's interesting how I got into this subject. It takes me back to I believe it was like in the mid 90s. And I wasn't looking for anything. I had a fairly busy private practice. I was doing supervision and training at the hospital where I did my internship, Hillside Hospital, now Zucker Hillside Hospital of Northwell. And wasn't looking for anything to do anything different. And the last thing on my mind was that I would someday be an expert on grief and trauma. I got a call from an organization that works with children with cancer, and the social worker of the organization asked if she could come to meet with me. And she came to my office and she told me that this year they had 6 parents who unfortunately lost children, and they'd like to do a retreat for those parents and others if they know about who have lost children. They were wondering if I would be what she called the anchor, if I would be the psychologist on the weekend. I often say at first I was very flattered. I later found out that I was the 7th psychologist they asked. Nobody wanted to go near the subject. And I can't say that I was relishing the idea of working with such painful situations. So, and as I said, I wasn't looking for anything. So I told her I want to think about it. And I remember after she left, I was sitting in my office and I said to myself, you know, if you're a mountain climber, you want to do Everest. This is Everest. And I decided to do it, and the weekend was very successful. We started doing more weekends. Next I know, I'm getting a reputation as an expert in grief, and culminating in the position that I hold now, which is that I direct a trauma and bereavement team through OHEL. And towards at the end of the slide, I have 1 or 2 slides just introducing you to OHEL and even a workbook that we have for coping with COVID. And we handle crises on an individual basis, on a communal basis. Just to, again, I can't obviously mention the individual, just to mention some of the communal crises that we dealt with. We were in Pittsburgh after the Pittsburgh shooting. We were in Malibu, California after the Woolsey fires. We were in Houston after the floods in Houston. We were in Jersey City after the shooting in Jersey City. And again, helping communities and individuals deal with loss and trauma. As I said, the work is trying emotionally, but also incredibly rewarding because we get to witness the amazing resilience of humankind. The way what I have here the topics, and I'm going to be presenting. I also have some group exercises. Now, if it was a smaller group, we could do the exercise and have a discussion. We can't with 137 participants and maybe more coming. So we'll do the group exercises. We'll give you just a few minutes to do them. And if somebody through the chat wants to share what that experience was, we'll cite those experiences. We also welcome people to submit questions and comments through the chat. I will attempt to address them as we go through this presentation. I have a tendency to over-prepare, so we may not get to everything, but we'll try our best. So these are the topics that I'm going to try to cover. First of all, the theories of why we grieve. We take it so for granted that if we experience a loss, that we're going to grieve. But who says, and what is behind psychologically? Why do we grieve? And is grief and depression the same or different? They look the same. They're both characterized by sadness. Are they similar or are they different conditions? And what's the function of pain in grief? Why were we created, or why do we evolve into beings that suffer from the death of a loved one? And what function does that pain serve? The notion of grief as growth, which we'll get into a bit more. Are there stages of grief? How does grief progress? And are there distinct, discernible stages? The notion of the ongoing relationship. What is our relationship with loved ones who died, and how do we preserve that? What is consolation? Is there how does grief reach a point of healing or relief, and what exactly that is. If we have time, we'll try to talk a little bit about grief counseling, although some of it might be self-evident by the time we get there. And then just briefly, I want to mention, talk about grief during the pandemic, some of the unique aspects of the grieving experience that we've been dealing with over the last 9-10 months. And then I said a short little introduction to OHEL Children's Home and Family Services, which is the agency that I'm representing here. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we'll start with a group exercise, okay? And this is strictly voluntary, but just to get you maybe into the mindset of grieving. And what I'm gonna ask you to do is to pick a memento or picture you have preserved from a loved one who died. Why do you think you picked that one? And what in your mourning facilitates this preservation of memory? How were you able to do that? Okay, again, we can't keep everything, yet we preserve memories, pictures, items, etc. So we're gonna pause for just a minute or two, and I want you to think about that, and then either keep it to yourself or share on the chat what you kept and what that represented to you.
We're getting a lot of great responses in the chat box.
Yeah.
Should I read some of them out, Dr. Blumenthal?
That would be nice. Sure. I'm looking at them myself, but sure.
Okay. I see my grandmother's ring because she wore it every day and it makes me feel like she's with me. My son's flannel shirt reminded me of good times when he was well. I kept the stuffed koala bear from my grandmother. It reminded me that she cared about me, even if she didn't know how to show it. There's so many coming in. Laughter, that's
incredible.
how, yeah, wonderful. My father's weighted blanket, which feels like his hug. A picture of my husband holding our children, showing the kids that daddy loved being with them. I kept my grandmother's piano. It reminded me of her passion for music. So many great ones. A picture of my dad getting on a trolley. It reminded me of his smile. Yeah, so many wonderful ones. Thank you all for your participation.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to read a few more? Or
I think we got to represent the route, and I would recommend everybody, if you can, look at the chat. They really are very moving and very much in the spirit of what we're going to be talking about. And I think you also see how people have selected, and I think that's very important, items and pictures that aren't just one item or picture, but capture the essence of the person. And this is going to be we're going to revisit this a lot when we talk about the preservation of the relationship. But again, they're beautiful, and we could probably spend the whole next hour and a half reading these and discussing them. So let's go on to the next slide then. Okay, with this in mind, but I said, please read them. They're really beautiful. So we're going to start with the theories of grief, and we're going to start with Freud's theory of grief. And the only reason is not because I'm trying to make this into a psychology lecture, but a lot of Freud's thinking about grief have permeated our general understanding, and some of it is not current. So I'm going to try to capture it very quickly. So those of you may know, Freud wrote, I believe it's 22 volumes. There's the standard edition of Freud's writing, which are 22 volumes of books. He was a prolific writer. And again, you can, except for those who maybe in a university are teaching courses on Freudian psychoanalysis, very few people have read all of them. But his second to last book that he wrote was called On Mourning and Melancholia. I'm not sure if he wrote it still in Vienna, or if it was after what they call the Anschluss, when the Nazis took over Vienna and he fled to London for the last year of his life. He wrote this book about grief. And I'm going to very quickly sum up what's probably a 200-300 page book. But basically, he tries to explain the sadness of grief as a sort of self-punishment. Because of any kind of unfinished business or lingering conflict. And basically the premise is that no relationship is perfect. Even in very loving and caring relationships, there's always those little pockets, those little areas of disagreement or frustration that everybody has. And as long as the person's alive, there's always that possibility for you to work it out and resolve that. But once a person dies, it becomes, let's put it this way, impossible or harder to work those matters out. So you feel guilty, a person feels guilty. And therefore, one kind of the pain is sort of like an expiation. It's sort of like a way of resolving or punishing yourself in a way for the pain that you're going through. Now, let's say it may sound kind of strange. It's not very current, and this is a book that was written 90 years ago, maybe, or something like that. But there are some outcomes of this that have, as I said, permeated our thinking, and some of them we're going to revisit and reconsider. So first of all, one thing is that once the premise is that once you've gone through this process of punishing yourself, then you're relieved of the guilt and you go back to the way you were. So that grief portrayed by Freud was, and for many years, the way we thought about it is sort of something you go through and then you get healed and go back to being who you were previously. It's a little bit, sometimes I say it's a little bit like a strep throat, right? So you or your kids get the sore throat and they're coughing and they're not themselves. And you go to the physician and he gives an antibiotic, you take the antibiotic, and then you or your child go back to exactly who they were. So that grief is something like that. Now, you're going to see that's something we're going to reconsider as we talk about more current thinkings about grief. Then there's a very interesting concept, which is to some extent still relevant. And that's what we call, it used to be called complicated. Now we're more inclined to call it ambivalent grief. So I discussed a more typical case, which is probably most representative, which is a very good relationship with little areas in which there's some resentment or some pain. But what if it's a little bit more complicated than that? What if it's not such just a predominantly positive relationship? What if it's a more mixed relationship? What if it's a marriage that it wasn't one of those horrific abusive marriages, but there were a marriage with a lot of problems and there were episodes of abuse, or one of those where there's that mixture of affection and abuse and that person dies. So there's a lot of unfinished business in that relationship. What if it's a rebellious child who gave the parents more than their fair share of gray hairs? What if it's a parent who had abandoned the child or largely abandoned the child when they were young? And there's a lot of mixed feelings. What's that person's grief like? Or can that grief reach a resolution? And that's still a relevant concept, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. And then there's something called pathological grief, which is a little bit more controversial, which is if it's a little bit like a strep throat, if you're supposed to just take an antibiotic and get better, or if you're supposed to engage in this sort of self-punishment and then be relieved, what happens if someone's still grieving 6 months later, a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later? Is that quote unquote pathological? Is there something wrong? Or is there such a thing as grieving or mourning too much? And that's something else we're going to address as we go through this PowerPoint. And again, please, you're welcome to submit suggestions, content, or for that matter, submit questions, and we'll address them. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. So again, I try to pepper it a little bit with some cartoons because the material is very heavy. So here it's during the eulogy. She says, "Mother wouldn't want us to feel sad. She'd want us to feel guilty." But what's the current thinking? And the current thinking is that grief is a growing process, a process of personal change. And this is the concept that I'm going to start developing now. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is there pain in grief? So let me present it to you in the following fashion. As I alluded to in the introduction, we have two conditions, if you will, two states. One is called depression, and one is called grief or mourning. And we basically know what both of them are. Depression is a psychiatric ailment, a mental illness, which is characterized by sad mood, morbidity, painful, emotional pain. Grief looks very similar. Grief is also characterized by sadness and emotional pain and morbidity. And therefore, for many, Freud included, many people saw depression and grief as kind of the same condition. Now, we have a technique called psychotherapy, and psychotherapy is not perfect, but when it comes to certain conditions, depression included, we have a very good track record. Between medication and psychotherapy, where the studies are different, but pretty much we can say that we are able to treat about 80% of people who are suffering from depression with psychotherapy and sometimes along with medication. So we have a pretty good track record when it comes to depression. We're better than the physicians doing with the common cold. So therefore, if psychotherapy is so effective with depression, and if depression and grief look so much alike, one would naturally expect that traditional psychotherapy would be effective with grief. And yet, as you can see from the slide, most studies show that people who enter therapy for grief, more traditional type of psychotherapy for grief, either it's useless and it might even be harmful. So that raises the obvious question. Here are two conditions that look so much alike. Why is it that therapy is not very effective with grief and yet very effective with depression? So can I have the next slide, please? So again, I'm not sure if the cartoon is as clear, but they say, no, the computers are up, we're down. So what's the difference? So first of all, there are 4 subsets of people within the grieving population, those who are mourning, who do benefit from psychotherapy. So I see somebody, okay, well, I'll check the chats in a minute. I see someone coming up, but one of them is at risk or pre-existing conditions. So in other words, if somebody had a pre-existing depression or anxiety, or borderline personality disorder, or any of those kind of conditions, or there's a family history, or there's a tendency towards that they were able to either address in psychotherapy or maintain it, then a loss, especially some of the more unexpected losses, such as loss of a child or a young spouse or something like that, can set that off, can make it, can bring it out. So a little bit like if somebody has either family history of lung disease or has a subclinical lung disease, if they're in a smoky or highly polluted area, it'll come out. So you can have situations where the grief will bring out a pre-existing condition, but then when you're treating with psychotherapy, you're treating the pre-existing condition. There's traumatic bereavement. In other words, a loss that all losses are traumatic, but where there's a heightened trauma, whether it be a vehicular accident, a fall, a murder, or a suicide, or something like that, then the trauma becomes so pronounced that it's an interesting phenomena that trauma and bereavement don't coexist well. So if there's heightened trauma, the person has trouble grieving because the trauma sort of consumes their brain. So you have to treat the trauma, and we have some excellent techniques for treating trauma. And once the trauma is relieved, then the bereavement can come out. Retaliatory grief, that's my own term, which is when there's revenge, when the person's very wronged. If somebody feels there's some heightened negligence on the part of somebody else that caused the death of the loved one. If it's in the throes of a war or a gang war or something like that, then the anger will get in the way of the grief, and you have to get the anger out in order for the grief to take place. And here we get back to what we mentioned with Freud, which is highly ambivalent relationships, complicated grief, losing the death of not a horrifically abusive spouse, but a spouse where there was that admixture of abuse and love, or as I said, a child who gave them a lot of heartache and something like that. Then when there's a lot of mixed feelings, then the therapy is necessary to work out the relationship, if you will, in order for the grief to take place. But otherwise, in your routine standard grief, psychotherapy does not work as it does with depression. We'll take a very quick Okay, so somebody asked, what's prolonged grief, depression? What is, we're going to get to that. Okay. Are there specific criteria to determine the shift to traumatic bereavement? Yeah, I mean, what happens is, okay, usually the early, we're going to get to that soon, but the beginning, when the person first dies, that's traumatic. To be present when someone dies. I was present when my 91-year-old mother died. Watching that monitor go flat is traumatic. Now, she was in pain, she was old, she was a great grandmother. It didn't have that same connotations that some other more horrific deaths would, but still just watching that happen is traumatic. So there is typically trauma in the beginning, but the trauma usually relieves pretty quickly and the grief takes over. But when it's circumstances where, again, if it was somebody in a car with somebody else who was driving while intoxicated, let's say, which is not an uncommon, unfortunately, situation. And well, that's really maybe more retaliatory. But let's say a situation, again, let's say if it was a suicide or a murder or something of that sort, then the trauma is so heightened that it doesn't get relieved so quickly. And while the trauma is there, it's hard to grieve. How much is grief impacted by ongoing injustice like police killings and inaction by authorities? So that's the point. That's the, if you will, retaliatory grief. When you're angry, when you feel that there was some very clear neglect or injustice, then that anger, again, it's almost as if your brain has so much room for such intense emotions that anger can sort of eclipse the grief. And not totally, I'm not saying that people don't grieve at all, but it makes them hard, it makes it much harder to go through that grieving process because the other emotion is so strong and the other emotion needs to find expression, maybe even resolution, so that then the grieving process can take place. Okay, what if a person's grief includes a cultural practice where the person holds yearly memories and expects others to remember their loved and grieve with them? Excellent question. If you don't mind, Yolanda, I'm going to get to that, talking about commemorations and what function that serves, and also the relationship with the community at large, how much people understand or don't understand. So hold on to that question. We're going to get to it. Okay, so let's, let me just put down the chat. Okay, can we go to the next slide? So here the question then comes is, what is this purpose of pain? What is the pain in grief? And then why would it not be responsive to psychotherapy? So first of all, let me start by saying what kind of problems, let's say I and some of you as mental health professionals or care providers, what kind of problems we face. So sometimes I can get a problem that I can solve. So again, let's get the example of depression. If somebody comes to me to see me for psychotherapy for depression, I have techniques. There are various types of therapy techniques in which I can relieve depression. If somebody comes to me for trauma, as I mentioned, we have many techniques, very good advanced techniques for relieving people of trauma. So I can relieve them problem. What happens when someone comes to a mental health professional for a problem that I can't solve? What if somebody comes because they have a child with incurable birth defects? What happens if somebody wants to have children and they have incurable infertility? What happens if somebody has a deformity? What happens? And then obviously at the point we're getting to death, I cannot undo death. How do we help people who have a problem that does not lend itself to a solution? And this touches upon also the difference between depression and grief, which I think most of you probably got. Depression is when one's mood is out of sync with the reality of their life. So they have a normal life. So everybody has some problems and some things that are upsetting them. But for the most part, their life is good. And yet they're in a bad mood. They're depressed. So there's a disconnect between the reality of their life and their mood. So therefore, the goal of psychotherapy, whatever the reason for that is to sort of elevate their mood, to make them happier, so their mood is commensurate, is in tandem with the reality of their lives. But in grief, you're supposed to be sad. Grief, the sadness and the pain is necessary. So therefore, a technique like psychotherapy, which is supposed to elevate the mood, is contraindicated for grief. Because in grief, you need the pain. The pain is essential. So it's kind of ironic, even for someone like myself who does both clinical work and grief work. If I'm in my office and somebody's seeing me for depression, I measure my success by how much happier I'll make the person. When I'm helping people in grief, I'm doing grief counseling, I measure my success by how much I allow the pain to come out. So it's really and that's why psychotherapy is not terribly effective with grief in contrast to grief counseling. So again, so when I have this situation where people are coming to me for a problem that I can't solve, what can I do for the person? So what I can do for the person is help that person change themselves, grow themselves so they can manage the part of their lives that is that they're suffering from. For example, I remember once I had someone who came to see me for an illness called ankylosing spondylitis. And don't be impressed with my medical knowledge. I only know it because I saw this person. Ankylosing spondylitis, some of you may know, is an arthritic condition of the spine, incredibly painful, one of the most painful diseases, and there's no cure. And he said oxycodone and all the painkillers are like water. They don't do anything. So he's living with chronic and constant pain. What can I do for someone like that? I can't get rid of his pain. So I have to help that person become the kind of person who can go on with life despite or with the pain. So that's sometimes referred to as the new normal. And that's the work of grief. Grief is in essence a growing experience. Now, I just want to mention George Bonanno, who's one of the prominent grief specialists, wrote a book called The Other Side of Grief. He says the pain is to intensify our focus, which is very interesting. He once did a study where he had people memorize certain, like just random words. And he told them they're going to test them later to see how many of these random words they can remember. But in the interim period, he showed them a film. But one group saw a very neutral film, and the other one saw a real tearjerker, a very sad film. And sure enough, he found that those who saw the sad film remembered more of those random words than those who saw the neutral film. So he says the pain is to focus us on the loss so that we can do the grief work. That's one theory. The alternative theory is the one that I'm coming to, which is that grief is a growing experience. Grief is a metamorphosis. And through grief, because again, we can't bring the loved one back, so we help the person become stronger and to grow so they can go on with life with this void that exists in their life. And therefore, that's then comes the point of why what the function of pain is in grief. Because how do we grow? We grow through pain. And it's a reality. If everything's good, we don't feel there's a need for a change. But when we're in suffering, when we're in pain, then we feel, because we want to get out of the pain, that we have to do something. And that's how we grow. So the function and why we've evolved as people who are in pain when someone dies is to allow us to grow and mature so we can go on with life, even though that person's not here. And we miss the person. And this is a theme I'm going to come back to again and again. You don't, quote unquote, get over grief. The grief stays. Everyone who's lost a loved one, they know you don't just forget about that person, but we become more evolved people so that we can handle it and go on with life despite what's missing. I sometimes use like what I call a heavy package metaphor. Imagine somebody's carrying a very heavy package and it's almost unbearably heavy. What can we do as a friend or as a family member? What can we do for that person? So one thing we could do is maybe lighten the package. So that might be psychotherapy for depression. But what if you can't? It's death. We can't bring the person, the deceased, back. What can we do for that person? So that person has to become stronger so they can carry the package. And that's, in essence, what grief is, in contrast, by the way, to the presentation of the theory of Freud, which is that we just go through it and go back to being who we are. We don't. We actually grow and mature. In fact, I've had people, particularly in the work I've done with parental loss of a child, that who have described to me that they'll see pictures of themselves before the death of their child. They don't even recognize themselves because they've grown so much, they've changed so much since that death. By the way, just in a quick aside, because I noticed that some people, when they did the exercise, mentioned the loss of a child. And they say that the Eskimos have 100 words for snow. That if it's something you deal with, you have a lot of words for it. We have a word in English for someone who loses a parent. They're called an orphan. We have a word in English for someone who loses a spouse. They're called a widow or a widower. You can go from the beginning of Webster to the end. There's no designation for a parent who loses a child. And I think that speaks volumes. There are in some other languages. But in English, there is no word for a parent who loses a child. So we refer to them as bereaved parents, but that's sort of a made up term. Again, I welcome people to submit comments, questions, etc. We'll address them as we go along. Okay, can I see the next slide, please? Now, here's a little sort of exercise. I'm going to name for you a whole bunch of people, and I want you to think about what they have in common. Okay, Alexander the Great, Tony Blair, Simone Bolivar, Aaron Burr, Julius Caesar, Catherine I, Neville Chamberlain, Chiang Kai-shek, Winston Churchill, Cleopatra, Grover Cleveland, Bill Clinton, Oliver Cromwell, Jefferson Davis, Abba Eban, Elizabeth I, Alexander Hamilton, John Hancock, Hannibal, Rutherford Hayes, Adolf Hitler, Ho Chi Minh, Herbert Hoover, Ivan the Terrible, Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, Genghis Khan, Khrushchev, Robert E. Lee, Lenin, Abe Lincoln, Slobodan Milosevic, James Monroe, Napoleon Bonaparte, Gamal Nasser, Nero, Barack Obama, Peter the Great, Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and George Washington. No, they're not all dead. They're all world leaders. Yes, that's one thing they all have in common. Not all of them are such nice people, and some are, but they are all world leaders. And you know what else they all have in common? Let's see if anybody else had anything. Yes, okay. The thing that they have in common is they all lost a parent when they were young. One or both parents when they were young. Which I often say somewhat facetiously, this teaches us two things. One is our children are probably better off without us, but more seriously, that it seems that there's something about losing a parent that promotes growth, that promotes drive, ambition, that there's something unique that has a certain type of maturation maybe that comes along. But again, speaking to the idea that through tragedy and through loss, we grow. Okay, next slide, please. Here's a quote from Winston Churchill. It says, "Solitary trees, if they grow at all, grow strong. And a boy deprived of a father's care often develops, if he escapes the perils of youth, an independence and vigor of thought, which may restore in afterlife the heavy loss of early days." Again, growth, and Winston Churchill was also one of those great leaders after the experience of death. Next slide, please. Okay, Sherry Mendel is actually a professional writer who lives in Israel, whose son Kobe, the one boy in the picture in the middle, was killed in a terrorist attack. And she wrote a book called The Blessing of a Broken Heart, a riveting book, very hard to read because she's a superb writer. But here's just a quote from that book. She said, "Just the night before he died, he lifted me up in his arms, showing me how strong he was. Then we measured and compared ourselves in the mirror, standing back to back. He was a fraction of an inch shorter than me. And now he will never reach me. I am left to do the growing for both of us." And that's the experience of grief. Grief is doing the growing for both of us. Next slide, please. So this, by the way, presents what is, and this was alluded to before, sometimes the problem with well-meaning members of the community, or sometimes even family, who want to help those who suffered a loss. One study found that 83% of comments that people make after the death of a loved one are unhelpful. I remember I once spoke to a group of bereaved parents, and I cited this study, and one of the parents said to me, "Doc, I don't like disagreeing with you, but I think it's more like 99%. Now, why? I mean, people are not cruel. People are not ill-intended. Why are so many comments unhelpful? And I think it speaks again to the point we're making now about the role of pain in grief. Many people want our natural inclination is, if we see someone crying, if we see someone in pain, we want to make them feel better. That's the way we are, you know. So if you're walking down the street and someone's sitting and crying, you're going to stop and say to somebody, you know, is there anything can help you? You know, we want to help them. So they say things to try to relieve the person of the grief, but that's not what they need. They need validation. They need the opportunity to experience the pain so they can experience the growth. And what I'll explain later is what consolation is. So unfortunately, a lot of these comments come from an attempt to undo or resolve the grief instead of allowing its expression. Here's a quote from a book that says, "Consolation is to sink into someone else's hell and stay there." In German, the Germans have an incredible ability to do things with words. My father's family originally from Germany, so I used to hear a lot of German. But in the German word for consolation is Trauerbegleitung, which there's no English equivalent, but means walking alongside. And really, what's very often more helpful for those who are grieving is either to be quiet, but not quiet in terms of inattentive, but to have a quiet presence, or to cry with the bereaved. So I see now there's some chats. Let me just take a quick look. Nothing takes away the pain. Yes, I'll explain that. You're 100% right. The pain doesn't go away. Consolation is not getting rid of the pain. I'm sorry for your loss. Yes, that's something to say. But again, has to be said. You have to be careful that you're not saying it in sort of a pitying way. People don't like to be pitied. But if you say it, and then that very often reflects your tone. If you say that I feel for you, I feel with you, I have to tell you that again, I deal with some of these most difficult losses, and I can't tell you how many people have told me that some of the most comforting visits were people who came and just cried with them, or hugged them, or just listened to them. This is part of what grieving is, and what part of consolation is. But unfortunately, again, with the best of intentions, people sometimes unfortunately try to relieve the person's sadness, and that's not what they need. They need to be validated. They need people to share with their sadness. I remember one person told me he lost a young child, and a friend of his from college, he lived in the New York area, and a friend of his from college lived in Baltimore. He said he drove 4 hours from Baltimore to New York, walked in, he was Jewish, so he was sitting Shiva. He walked into where they were sitting Shiva. He cried, sat there and cried for 10 minutes. There's a certain verse people say when they leave in the Shiva house. So he said that verse and he went home. He said he drove 8 hours for a 10-minute cry. He said that was the most comforting visit. Okay, let me just see again, there's some comments. So let me see what people are saying. I'm here for when you're, yes, very beautiful thing to say. Please accept my condolences. Yes, nice actions over words. Let me know if you need anything. More often than not, we'll not let someone know if we need something. That's true. People don't, one of the interesting things, I wasn't gonna go into that, but one of the interesting things of doing trauma work and bereavement work is people have a very hard time transitioning from being the benefactors to the beneficiaries. They don't like, we don't not proud of ourselves when we have to receive help. We want to be the helpers, but sometimes in life's a cycle, and sometimes you need help and sometimes you're the helper. And some people have a hard time with that. Oh, the other thing, by the way, to be careful about is I find that sometimes right after the death, people shower them with gifts and help, etc., and then forget them. Sometimes I tell people do less, but do it consistently through the whole grieving period. I express my condolence, hug, that's yes, very important, beautiful, and let them know I'm here. That's right. That's a very important part. Anytime you need me. I remember once one person who was giving birth to a child was very ill, and had a whole year of in and out of the hospital, setting up a hospital room, etc. And then the child died around his first birthday. And about 3 weeks afterwards, he was in a mall and he bumped into a friend of his from high school. He hasn't seen in like 8 years. So he said to him, well, what's going on? So he just spilled out of him, and he told about that whole year with the child and everything like that. And he took out a piece of paper and he wrote down his phone number and he said, call me anytime. And he said, that was beautiful. That was perfect. Didn't try to tell him, oh, it's not so bad. He's in a better place. He made himself available. You avoid saying, and yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Chris. You don't understand. Everybody's grief is unique. So sometimes they say, oh yeah, I know. I know what it must be like to lose a spouse. I lost my great grandmother. That you have to be careful. You have to not understand, but you can say, I want to understand. I want to know. I want to share with you as much as possible. But it's again allowing the pain to come out and validating their pain. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you for the comments. They're very helpful. I appreciate it. Here, beautiful study. I'm going to read it. The benefits of crying. All right, Dr. William H. Frey II, the biochemist at St. Paul Ramsey Medical Center, Minnesota. He and his team analyzed 2 types of tears, the emotional ones, crying when emotionally upset and stressed, and the ones arising from irritants, such as crying from cutting onions. They found that emotional tears contained more of the protein-based hormones prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone. I probably made that up, but all right. And leucine enkephalin, a natural painkiller, all of which are produced by our body when under stress. It seems as if the body is getting rid of these chemicals through tears. That explains why you usually feel better after a good cry. So when we're crying, we're ridding the body of stress hormones. Whereas if we're cutting onions, we're not ridding the body of stress hormones. And therefore a cry is good and crying is healthy. And we should never try to suppress someone from crying, especially after a loss. If they're crying because their favorite team didn't win the Super Bowl, we could tell them that that maybe that's not something to cry about. But certainly after the types of situations we're dealing with, crying is adaptive and essential. Can I have next slide, please? Here, I think, is a very beautiful example of how you extend condolences. This is from a book called The Natural History of the Piano by Stuart Isaacoff. In 1804, the pianist Dorothy Ertmann, who had studied Beethoven's work with the composer, lost her young son. Mrs. Ertmann was so stricken that for weeks she was unable to weep. Hearing of her grief, Beethoven invited her to his house to offer his condolences, though he said not a word. He, quote, he played for more than an hour until Ertmann began to sob. When she told the story years later to Felix Mendelssohn, she said that Beethoven's playing told me everything and at last brought me comfort. Okay, I see some chats, so let me just take a quick look. Okay, for me, the most unhelpful is when people try to fix it to deal with your own discomfort with that, and then you have to suit them. Yes, I hear that all the time. I hear people saying that they were more busy taking care of the visitors than taking care of themselves. And yes, rituals, we'll get to them in a minute. Cultural and you'll find, in fact, that the Journal on Death and Dying, which is Omega, is again on research and studies, usually dedicates about half the journal to different cultures and ways and fashions in which different cultures grieve. But the interesting thing is that in a way they're more similar than dissimilar. The actual practices may be different, but the function, and one of the functions, another one we'll get to in a minute, of allowing the bereaved to express their feelings and let the community share with it is pretty much what they all have in common. Although, as I said, the actual, it's almost like the garb is different, but the function is the same. Okay. Okay, for me, the most helpful is when people try to deal with your own discomfort, death, and then you have to soothe them. This is so true, especially with a baby loss. Oh, there's a very important point. You end up having to help the other person, their extreme discomfort with this hard topic. By the way, perinatal loss of infants is often, there are two types of deaths. I mean, we don't have time to go into everything, that are often referred to as a disenfranchised grief. In other words, grief that does not get its due. One of them is the death of an infant or stillbirth, which is a real loss. And there is grieving, especially for the mother in those instances, and those deserve their due recognition, don't get it usually. And the other one is sibling loss, believe it or not. We don't really focus as much on the loss of siblings. In general, we don't focus as much on sibling relationships. And that's also another area that's often referred to as a disenfranchised loss. I find helping some males give themselves permission to cry is one of the most difficult areas of my work. We get there, but it takes time. That's true. Although, gender differences are getting more and more blurred nowadays. And I think, in fact, a lot of the research shows that men are starting to become more comfortable being emotional. In fact, if you're interested, and if it's of interest to you, the APA, the American Psychological Association, actually put out a very lengthy, not lengthy, but a big work on the redefining masculinity. And much of it addresses this issue of being comfortable with being emotional or being comfortable with being vulnerable. And I think in that respect, it's a very big contribution to allowing men to be more comfortable with their emotions. If you're interested, you can I believe it's available even online. I don't think you have to purchase it. Okay, let me have the next slide. Okay, let's do a group exercise. And what I'm going to do now at this point is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to pull up a poem. Okay, it's going to stop the other person's screening. Okay, and then we'll have to come back to the, okay. So here is a poem, and I'm going to read it. And again, as a group exercise, I would invite you to respond, but we're responding anyway, so feel free to. The poem is called What It Is. It's been a year. You should be over it. What exactly is quote unquote it? But the people who have never suffered loss really know what quote it is. To us, the bereaved, it is Halloween and you pass out candy You remember all the memories of past happy times together and make you sad. It is seeing milestones in your life progress and pass and your loved one is gone, never to share them with. It is looking at the moon and wondering if they see the same moon like the two of you always did in the past. It is receiving wedding invitations to their friends' weddings and knowing that life goes on without your loved one. It is going back to into that church for the first time and remembering, but not remembering, and feeling that all eyes are on you. It is going to another funeral for the first time and feeling yourself shaking all over, too distraught to stay but unable to leave. It is doing all those things you always did, plus all the things you hope to do together, and doing it all when all of your energy has been used for grieving. It is being strong when you really feel weak. It is dealing with all the legality of estates and such when all you want to do is hibernate. It is a whole bunch of stuff you didn't ask for, didn't want, and can't even give away. It is going to a cemetery and seeing the monument with their name and even face, and it hits you that this is real. It is feeling like a traitor when you get rid of their personal belongings. It is approaching the first anniversary of the death and reliving it all. Oh yes, some things might be better, but the void is no less. It is people forgetting and you cry, and people remembering and you cry. It is a future of unknowns, uncertainties, emptiness. It is the first glimpse of sunrise and your last waking breath, and even finds ways to creep into your sleep and your dreams. So maybe when someone tells you that you should get over it by now, you should tell them what it really is. Okay, I don't know if, I think now you have to, Emily, can you reshare? Yeah. So I welcome people to respond and capture, because this is really in a way, by way of introduction to our next topic is how does grief progress, or do you get over it? Okay, so now any of you who have taken a course okay, one second, there's some comments, I'll quickly look at it. This is a really painful poem, but right on the point. Thank you. This is awesome. It's available somewhere. Well, I guess the slides, I'll share. I'll be happy to share the poem. I forgot where I saw it. This is beautiful and meaningful. That hits home. Okay, I guess, yeah, thank you. Those of us who may have gone to graduate school, or even college, or even picked up bereavement brochures will see the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of a reaction to death. Now, I in no way mean to diminish the importance of what Kubler-Ross has done for the field of death and for the field of psychology. She made a major contribution. And as I said, it's become almost like gospel that that's what people go through, these 5 stages of death. In fact, I mentioned that I was involved with the Jersey City shooting, and we had a meeting in Jersey City Hall to see how we can help at that point the Hasidic community with their grief. And I was waiting for the meeting, and I saw a brochure that was to help police officers if a fellow officer dies, and I pick it up, and sure enough, in the brochure it says, and you're going to go through these 5 stages of death. And as I said, Kubler-Ross made a huge contribution, and she brought the study of death into the area of psychology. And each of those 5 stages are significant. But, and by the way, the stages are adopted, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. But there's no empirical evidence. There's no studies that show that you go through these stages. And I think it's a terrible disservice. I've had people even say to me, I know it's amazed me, I'm not going through these stages. There's no evidence that people go through a stage. In fact, there's some studies that show that actually acceptance is the first stage. Now, by the way, I have a picture there of Bart Simpson. If you have time and you could use a good laugh, we don't have time now ourselves, but I would welcome you to go on YouTube and search for Bart Simpson's 5 stages of death. In the cartoon, he finds out he's going to die, and in 30 seconds goes through all of the 5 stages. But there's acceptance. So people do not go through these kind of 5 stages. Each one is important as an experience of a reaction to death, but you don't have to go in that sequence. Now, first of all, one thing that's very important to understand about grief, and for yourself, or if you're helping someone, is that grief is not linear. It doesn't go in a straight line. So logic would dictate you'd be most upset at first, and it gets better and better and better. It's not like that. It's an in and out experience. There's good days and bad days. There's good weeks, bad weeks. There's good months. There's bad months. Grief is like a little bit of a roller coaster, and that's sometimes important. Because a person might say, I had a few good months, and then came this month, and I was terrible. Sometimes there's clear reminders. It could be birthdays, anniversaries of the death. There could be finding something that belonged to the person who died, and then the grief comes back, but sometimes out of the blue. My understanding of it is that, when you lose a loved one, you don't just lose a person, it's a world. And different aspects of what this person means to you sort of enters your psyche. And it's a very individual experience. And it's very important that everybody recognize that people grieve differently, people's relationships are unique, and therefore each grief is going to be distinct. Next slide, and then I'll check the chats. I see there's a bunch of them. I think it's important also to understand that Kubler-Ross herself actually died pretty young, died in her 50s, actually retracted the stages herself. She said these stages have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but they are not typical response to loss, and there are no typical loss, as there's no typical loss. Our grief is individual as our lives. So again, be careful. And unfortunately, it's still out there and people are saying it. So understand that you don't have to go through these exact stages in that order. Okay, let me just read some of the, a lot of comments. I hope I can get to them. My mother passed away in April from COVID. I'm sorry to hear. And I have had people say, when you're going to get over it, it's such a painful thing to say. Absolutely, you don't get over it. And I'll explain to you what consolation is, but it's not getting over it. You don't get over the loss of a mother. Is there a link to that poem? I was trying to find it. I couldn't. I don't remember where I got it from, but I'll search some more. Because before I came here, I wrote them. I didn't have the link, and I came across it, and I was sloppy in that respect. But I'll try to find it. A friend of mine died of COVID in the spring. A present I ordered them arrived in our mailbox 2 months later. Yes, I've had that experience too. I remember actually my roommate in college. His father died. He was from Syracuse. And his father died. And in fact, I remember coming back to my room after a class, and the room was empty and the door was open. I said, that's not like Joey. And then his cousin came and told me that his father died. And I went up to Syracuse to the funeral, but before I left, I went to the mailbox for a letter. For those young people who don't know what a letter is, that's before emails. We used to take paper and a pen and put it in an envelope with a stamp. And so he had a letter from his father. And so I put the letter with me, and I remember I wasn't sure what to do when I got there. And I asked the rabbi of the congregation what you doing. He said, you have to give it to him. It was a very painful experience. So I know what you mean. Okay, so I lost my uncle on April 12th and my dad on April 7th. Wow, both to COVID. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear. It's an interesting thing. We'll talk about this more when we talk about trauma, but traumatic experiences, when there's a trauma or on top of a trauma, loss on top of a loss, it grows exponentially. So sorry. And I'll talk a little bit about death from COVID towards the end of the presentation. Okay, can I have the next slide? Okay, so how does, again, the progression of grief? So first of all, what do we know about how grief progresses? So one trend we're aware of, which is that early grief tends to be a whole mixture of emotions. People sometimes talk about being punched out, almost like they're angry, they're jealous, they're sad, they're confused. There's a whole lot of emotions. But as time goes on, it sort of narrows down to one feeling, which is really the basis of grief, which is that the person's not here, the absence, that profound absence. And by the way, that has some bearing. A very common question I get asked is the grief different depending how the person died? Is it different if the person died of an illness or if it was a sudden occurrence? Is it different if it's a suicide or if it's a murder or if it's a terrorist attack? Or does it matter how the person died, and that'll affect the grief? And the point is that in early grief, it makes a difference. We mentioned earlier that sometimes there's angry feelings, sometimes there's trauma, but as grief progresses, it really does make a difference. When we do retreats for parents who lost children, and before COVID we did, but in early grief, it doesn't, sometimes there are differences, but as those, once you get a few months into the grief, it really doesn't, people who lost children or to suicide or to car accidents or to cancer, they all sort of connect, because it's really what matters is that the person's not here. They often talk about the empty space. The picture at the family gathering And the person here, in fact, what some people do actually is bring a photograph of the deceased family member and put them there in the family picture so let them know that they're still part of the family. You know, you make a reservation for a restaurant, you're making a reservation for 4 instead of 5 or something like that. There's a term you hear a lot is we meet their absence everywhere. And that's what happens because loved ones are just so much a part of our life. Mementos, what do you keep? What do you give away? The room. When parents have lost children, the child has a room. Do you clean up the room? Do you leave the room exactly the way it was? You know, and these are huge questions, no answer. You can't tell somebody what to do. It's their decision. Pictures. And then the trick with what you keep, and this goes back to our original exercise in terms of mementos and pictures, is you can't keep everything and you can't throw away everything. The process is one of making a choice, but you try to keep those things that capture the person the most. I recently was helping a family where there was a young wife who died, and it was a very moving because the husband was madly in love with her. I mean, it was really very, and he announced that he's going to have a painter come to the house, and this was right after she died, and paint a mural on every wall of his wife. And the kids were going crazy. They said, no way, I'm moving out. You know, I can't have friends over. I had to explain to them, yes, you want to remember your wife, but you can't overdo it and you can't underdo it. You have to have just selected items and pictures that capture who this person is. Okay, let me just look at some. There's so many comments. Okay, friend of mine died of COVID in the spring. Oh, I'm sorry, this one I read. Okay. Okay, to my dad in March. We still haven't been able to have a ceremony for him, but I feel the grieving process is never ending. Yes, that we're going to get that later. That we're being deprived of so much by this pandemic, and one of them is having normal grief. This on the point. I got news this morning. An extended family member in Puerto Rico passed due to COVID. I'm so sorry to hear. Okay, I also cried. I was told 2 months into my mother being quarantined nursing home, I was told to deal with it. Yeah. Just people don't, and they don't mean harm. They just don't get it. That's how I'm not being able to be by their son, not being able to proper burial. And yes, we're going to get to that. You're pretty much actually preempting you're stealing my thunder because these are the points I'm getting to later. I mail arrive for my son all the time, even when I'm informed every agent others. Yes, and that just brings it back. It just brings it back so painfully. Thank you for all the chatting and your beautiful memories. Oh, okay. Okay, this is from Emily, important point in terms of CEUs. So those who have lost loved ones during COVID and of COVID, it is a terrible time to lose someone now in social distance. Hope that your people sit with that pain with you. Yeah, it's, you know, it is, listen, remote visits are just not the same. Absolutely. My husband lost his father suddenly after Thanksgiving. He lived overseas, so there was no service, no communication with his stepmother after the initial call. Because of the distance, it seems more difficult for him. Yes, it is. The empty chair for the love, right? That chair on the table, right? Very good point. Their place at the dinner table. There are no answers when your child is murdered. You're right. There are no answers, and people who try to give you answers are doing you more harm than good. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? All right. Again, maybe we can use a little comic relief, but I told them wouldn't kill them. Try to be nice once in a while, but I was wrong. Okay, so what is consolation then? If we're saying, and everybody's saying, look at all the comments in the chats, that it's there forever, the void is felt forever. What is consolation? So I'll tell you experience I had, and it was an insight for me. I'm sure many of you might have had this experience, but when you develop a sort of expertise, sometimes what comes out of your mouth, you can't even believe yourself, but you have a sort of grasp on the material. And I was involved in a situation in another city where unfortunately a young man was run over by a drunk driver, but it was it was witnessed by not only his family, but many children who had him as a camp counselor. And so it was trauma on top of grief. And I was visiting that city, helping out people, helping the community, helping the family. And I was interviewed by some radio personality. And he's asking me more about the trauma for the young children who witnessed this. And then he said to me something. He said, Dr. Blumenthal, what about the family of this young man? Will they ever get over it? And I couldn't believe the words came out of my mouth that I said it, but I said to him, the grief will be forever, but the pain will be less. So if you want to understand consolation, you have to make a differentiation between the pain and the grief. Okay, that in essence, I'll just read you, this is my definition. Consolation is by definition the mastery of grief and the reduction of acute pain rather than removal or disappearance of grief. Loved ones who died, we miss them forever. We don't stop grieving. But what happens is, and then I'll get back to my original premise, the growth that occurs from the pain of the grief, that growing experience makes the pain less. So the pain stays the same, but we become stronger, like with the package, and we can handle it. And grief, consolation, and the end of the grieving. And by the way, it's not quick either. We find, for example, in parental loss of a child, it's about a 5-year process. Not 5 years where you just sort of stand still and suddenly have consolation, but it takes a while. And especially some of these deaths that we're talking about, and some of these more traumatic deaths. But what happens is you become the kind of person who can handle it. I remember 2 quotes from bereaved parents in groups that I ran. One of them was once trying to describe to a more recently bereaved parent what it's like now. He was like about 5 years later. And he said to him, now it's not the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning. He didn't say stop grieving, but it's not the first thing he thinks about when he wakes up in the morning. Another bereaved mother once described it. She said, I now carry my grief around in a package and I bring it out when I need it. So you have sort of control, mastery over it, but it's like, but you don't get over it, but you integrate it, you redefine your world, you redefine your understanding of yourself, and you manage then to tolerate and handle it. And that's really what consolation is, but not getting over it. Okay, let me just see some comments. Okay, exactly, thank you. Okay, the grief of someone who you loved passed and will not see them anymore versus the grief of someone you love but is alive and you will never be together again. I'm not sure what you're referring to, but it's interesting. You might be referring to situations like parental alienation or grandparent alienation, where the person is, or maybe a severance in relationships that can occur between family members. And you're right, in a way that's harder than grief. Death is death. I mean, it's terrible, but it's final. But if there's a loved one or someone you care about who, for whatever circumstances, or if it might be even immigration or something, and you can't be together with them or connect with them, that's a very difficult pain because they're there and they're not there at the same time. It's why I say I miss my mom dearly, but I've learned to accept her absence next week. It's 16 years. Yeah, but 16 years, you still miss your mom. That's not, you're not going to not miss her, but you're able to, you've been integrated that reality into who you are. I've used an analogy of nerve damage to describe grief. Those nerves are lost, they'll never go back, but others will grow in. Very nice, and help restore some of your previous function. Will never feel the same. That's very beautiful. Thank you. You don't get over it, but you get through it. That's a nice way of putting it too. Thank you. What can you do when others say, where's your faith? If you have still grieving and crying, you do get stronger as time goes by. Yeah, I don't think it's an absence of faith. I'm not a clergy, but you can believe in God and in Almighty, and you can even think that there's some purpose and function in your tragedy, even if you don't understand it. Birthdays and death dates are pain reminders, like we have to remember this pain we hold. Yeah, but some people welcome it. Some people, in fact, it's an interesting thing is that some people want the pain. And I don't mean in a crazy kind of way, like masochism or something like that, but the pain is the connection with the person. So the birthdays and the anniversaries and the commemorations are meaningful to them because they feel reconnected to the person. Can I have the next slide? And by the way, I really am grateful for these comments. I have to tell you that most of what I've learned is not from the research and scholars, but from people who've had the courage to share with me their own experience. Now, here's a very, very important part of grieving, and something that we have to keep in mind, which is the ongoing relationship. Here I have a quote from Dr. Craig Figgio, who's a prominent grief specialist. No one we have ever loved can totally disappear from our lives. Our loved ones live on in our gestures, our mannerisms, our beliefs, and our feelings. The deceased leave their mark on our very being. As a result of this internalization process, the influence of our loved ones extend far beyond death. And so the way, can I have the next slide, please? What I'm trying to point out, and here's the point, the first quote here, death doesn't end a relationship, it changes it. When someone dies, the relationship doesn't end, but it changes from a face-to-face relationship to a relationship of memories, to a relationship of legacies. And this is extremely important to understand because you still have a relationship with the person who died. And there's a lot of literature. It's very interesting. And I mentioned the Omega magazine, which is a psychological journal. So they prefer to rely upon research and data, but you'll get every once in a while articles that talk about post-death encounters, and usually there's a little asterisk and a caveat that says we're not saying that these are actually happening, et cetera, because they want to be scientific. But people report a lot of connections with people who died, dreams. In fact, I've run groups where one member will talk about dreaming about their loved one, the other ones are jealous because they haven't dreamt. They feel like they have like a reunion during the dream. Very common theme is animals, particularly animals that typically run away or are not, or are very mobile and transitory, who stay or nestle up to a person as if the soul of the person is in that animal. I remember once visiting someone who lost a son who lived in an apartment in Manhattan, and it was an older apartment, so they had those big air conditioners. And at one point while we were talking, he pointed to the air conditioner, and there was a pigeon on the air conditioner, nothing out of the ordinary for Manhattan. And he said, "You see that pigeon over there?" He said, "That pigeon hasn't left since her child died." And it, again, the sense that it's there. Another fascinating experience is finding missing items, finding something that has something to do with the person who died that was missing for years, and suddenly it's in a very obvious place, almost as if the person came and put it there. So these are important experiences because, again, the person feels connected. And here it's a very interesting part of this work is that, most of the work we do is culture free. It's not, it doesn't matter, when we're doing psychotherapy, it's not of terrible relevance what the person's belief systems are or religion. But when you're doing this kind of work, you have to check in on the person's beliefs, the psychospiritual. Do they believe in a soul? Do they believe in hereafter? Do they believe in resurrection of the dead? So when I do grief work, when I do my regular clinical work, it's of little importance to me, or unless, again, it can come up in therapy, but it's not essential for me to know what the person's particular belief system is. But when I'm doing grief work, I do want to know if they believe that the person still exists in some fashion or way. I'm not going to try to inculcate a belief. That's not my business, but I can work, if I want to even encourage a conversation with the person who died, I can do so if they have that within their belief system. Let me just look at the chats. I see some other birthdays and death dates are pain reminds of it to remember this pain we hold. Yeah, and people want that pain. They want that connection. My son's birthday, I donate to a charity in his name. Yes, that's, again, I haven't gotten a chance to get into everything, but that's one of the things we do is commemorations or meaningful acts in memory of the person. It kind of undoes the senselessness of the death. Birthdays and anniversaries are ways some individuals keep their loved ones in memory and other thoughts. I think it is part of the healing. Yes, absolutely. And that's the time to get together and remember and share stories and recall the person, which, by the way, is very important. I love asking people, if let's say I'm paying a Shiva visit, I'll ask them, tell me a story about your father, your husband, your child, because a story captures the person in just a few words and you get a sense of who the person is. Next slide, please. Here's a very beautiful quote. By the way, it's from a lovely article. I think Thomas Attic is really special in terms of his, a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of growth and et cetera comes from his work. But here's a quote from his article. Or so he has written books and many articles. This is just from one of them. The central challenge as we grieve is moving from a life where we love them in the presence to a new life where we love them in the absence. Nothing is more difficult, nothing is more important, and nothing is more rewarding. So that's in essence what grief is. We go from loving them in the presence to loving them in the absence. Okay, I see another chat. Let me take a quick look. I pray for our loved one daily. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Next slide, please. Here, by the way, is a very nice, again, those of you may be familiar with some of the Jewish customs. During that week, Jews after the burial have a week of what they call sitting Shiva, which is a week in which the family sits on low chairs, their garments are ripped, and people visit them and talk about the deceased. And one of the customs is to cover mirrors. And why do we cover the mirrors? So here's, just to explain it, there's a Jewish custom to cover mirrors during the 7-day mourning period. One reason suggested for this custom is that a mirror only portrays the individual when he or she is standing there. During mourning, we preserve the memory of the person when they are no longer in our immediate presence. So we cover the mirrors. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, again, this would be a group exercise, which I welcome you to. I mean, we're really running out of time, so maybe I won't pause, but I'm going to welcome you to share a memory of a story of a loved one who died. and the listeners should share what they know about that person, because that's really grief. Rather than telling people get over it or stop grieving, know about the person, get information about the person. That's what I do. I will ask them, introduce me to your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, your father, your mother. I want to get to know them. And then that helps preserve the relationship. That helps that transition from a relationship of loving them in the presence to loving them in an absence. And if you want to share some of those, please feel free to do so in the chat. I'm going to move a little quicker because I want to get through the rest of the material. Okay, so we have one, so let's quickly get to, so already some are coming through. So let's see if we have time. My son was caring and would give you the shirt off his back. Yes, that's something. And if you can tell people stories of how he did that, it would be a very meaningful. Let me just look again quickly. My grandmother passed. I was extremely distraught and made a vow to think about her every day. Beautiful. She came into my dreams many times. And one of the last dreams I had with her was I was going up on a hill to have a picnic, and her telling me to let go as she is winning a euchre game with her friends, and I keep interrupting it. I love it. I experienced a sense of peace knowing she was okay. Every time I see a cardinal, I know that she is checking up on me and connecting. Very beautiful. Thank you very much. My mom was murdered when I was a teenager. My favorite memory is when I was sad, she would tell me to put my head on her belly and comb my hair with all my worries go away. And do that for if you have children or friends or whatever are grieving, you can take that with you. And then that's a tribute to her. And it sort of keeps her alive. I do that for my son. Great, beautiful, thank you. Okay, can we have the next slide? Okay, the basics of bereavement counseling, again, I'll go through very quickly. Understand that early grief, the first when the death occurs, is trauma. Self-care is very important early on. People get so consumed by the loss that they're not taking care of themselves. A lot of it is psychoeducation, orienting toward events and mourning. Most of the grief counseling takes place after the funeral. And grief counseling is not weekly sessions like psychotherapy. I mean, the people that I help, I'll hear from them 3 times a week. I want to hear from them for 3 months, and I'll hear from them again 3 times a week. When they call you, when they need you, and that's the nature of this work. You have to let them have the pain, and you have to trust your intuitive responses. This is very important. People naturally know what especially when they're suffering, they have I call it a psychological adrenaline rush. They know what they need. And you have to listen to them, unless they have a psychiatric illness. I mean, if they have a serious psychiatric illness, then they're distorting reality. But short of that, you have to hear what people say. And sometimes they say, I need to do this or I need to do that. I need to go to the cemetery. I need to stay away from the cemetery. There's not one right way. For one person, going to the cemetery is important. For another one, staying away is important. One person may clean up the room within the first month, and others may keep the room as a sanctuary for years. And each one is right for themselves. So you have to trust their intuitive responses. Next slide, please. Basis of bereavement counseling. And again, the cartoon, sadly, Barbara was the only one to show up in support group for those with abandonment issues, but preserving the memories and memorials, maintaining the relationship. By the way, this is particularly important if there's complicated grief, is that ambivalent grief. I have gone to the cemetery with people, and we have literally at the gravesite had an argument, not with me and them, but between the person deceased and them, to work out some unfinished business. So that's a lot. We do letter writing. This is part of the grieving process. Assist through birthdays, anniversaries, temporaries, milestones. That's, by the way, for those who've lost children, perhaps the hardest part, we refer to that as mourning the future, is when the contemporaries, when the peers reach milestones, when they graduate, when they go off to college, when they get married. Each one is a stab in the heart, very hard. And again, that's where we come in to help. I had a woman who lost a teenager to a pedestrian accident, and I heard, I helped her out, and I didn't hear from her for years. And then her friends started getting married, and that's when I started hearing from her again. And then also insulating yourself from the well-meaning but hurtful remarks other people make. Let me check the chats again. Everyone's grief is different. Yes, it's true. Sharing a story about your loved one gives you the opportunity to say their name aloud. Oh, please, very important. Yeah, you're unable to say if they're not present. I have 3 rules when I run bereavement groups. One is, share how you cope, but don't try to impose it on someone else. Everybody's grief is unique. Talk about the person in the present tense if you can. So it's not like my husband was loving, my husband is loving. And my third is say the name, not my husband, Bob, Tom, whatever. Say it makes it much more immediate. I've created bleeding clips from pieces of my son's clothing. Beautiful. Wow, amazing. Thank you for sharing. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, again, grief during the pandemic. Otherwise, health, first of all, it was the suddenness of it. I can't tell you how many times I heard stories of people said, you know, he walked into the ambulance, he was fine, and then suddenly he's dead, and we couldn't spend time with him. There wasn't that, again, that's a whole other area. We call that sometimes pre-bereavement or anticipatory grief. But you know, the chance to be with the person as they die, because again, you couldn't be in the hospital. Compromised funerals, burial ceremony, commemorations. Many people mentioned. One of the things that I found very interesting was many people commented that after the grieving, usually then you go back to normal life. But for many people, they would go through the grieving commemorate, they go through the wake, the funeral, burial, and then they're still home, and that was a deprivation. By the way, big issue is for children who lost a parent to COVID, a fear of losing the other parent. And I mean, they want to like put the parent in a bubble, and understandably. And the missing out on returning to routine, and the mathematics of trauma, which I alluded to earlier, which is when there's a tragedy occurs on the heels of tragedy, it grows exponentially. Let me just take a quick look at the chats. Okay, resources, sure. I'll be in touch with me through Emily, and I'll give you resources. Emily may have resources as well. I know it could be periodic as an internet house to help clients, because sometimes I didn't see them consistently, but now when I can help them, yes, absolutely. It's not the same, it's not therapy. I've been accused of dwelling in grief, but to me, that's how I keep them present in my life. You do what you feel is right. Don't listen to what anybody else says. Also, when everyone is struggling with their own issues during the pandemic, they have less, and you provide comfort to those are grieving losses. That's true. We call that the shared traumatic reality. I'll talk about that in the trauma program that I'll be giving. When you're helping someone with trauma and you're in that same trauma. That's my dad. He went to his dialysis when he got sick, coughing. The test was negative, and the lady was positive, and less than 12 hours passed, and all I got was to see him on the last breath through Zoom. Terrible. It's really a deprivation. My nephew got married, beautiful time. I was joyous until I saw a picture of my son at the memory table. Yeah, that's a whole issue. How do you celebrate after a death? Can you repeat the 3 things you do during the session? Say their name, talk about in person as they are present. And what is the third is that I don't impose your coping skills on another person, because what works for you may not work for the other person. It's a very individual experience. And sometimes that can get in the way of healing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, can you grieve too much? I don't want to get into it, but it's rare. It's rare. Most people grieve normally. There are situations, some of them I went through before, which the grief gets prolonged, and you can tell that by failure to make progress, isolation, or self-destructive, neglectful behaviors. Let me go to the next slide. Again, I tell you, I tend to over-prepare. Here's a beautiful quote from Thomas Attic, and it's, by the way, sometimes to help people shake them out of that situation if they are mired in grief. The interesting thing is that, again, I don't know how many people were by their loved ones when they died, but most of the messages from loved ones who died is that you go on living, you know, get remarried. Don't be too sad. Even, by the way, suicide notes, and only 1/3 of people who die of a suicide leave notes, but most of the notes are loving and pleading with the person, with the family, not to stop living. So sometimes what I'll say to the person is, what does your father, mother, husband, wife, son, daughter want you to do now? And almost always say, oh yeah, they want us to, of course, go on living. So here's a beautiful quote from Thomas Attic. Those who died wanted us to remember and to cherish the good that was in them and our lives with them. And they wanted us to return to, thrive, and prosper in the world they no longer inhabit, to cherish life they no longer enjoy. We love those who died when we go on without them by our sides, with lasting love for them in our hearts, with our hearts open again to the wonders of life on this earth. Next slide, please. I'm rushing a little bit because we're running out of time. I'm sorry. So this is, again, an exercise you can do on your own, but write a letter to someone you know who has died and then share it with others. Okay, next slide, please. So let me just quickly introduce you to OHEL, and then I'll check the chats. OHEL was founded in 1969 as basically a foster agency, but has grown tremendously now. We have over 1,500 professional volunteers providing foster care, housing, day programs, outpatient facilities, and compo provisional care. The trauma team, as I mentioned, is licensed mental health professional providing assistance in the event of trauma, loss of life. And so we were busy in Pittsburgh, the Woolsey fires in California, floods in Houston, among others. Next slide, please. We put together, by the way, what's proven to be a very popular COVID-19 resilience workbook for children 5 to 10. It's skill building activities that can be done with parents, teachers, and children. And the key messages on coping and growing are presented through child-oriented activities. If you would like it, at the bottom, there's the link to get the workbook. It's free. I'm not sure if we charge for shipping. I don't remember now, but if it's a nominal charge, maybe for shipping, but otherwise, it is available to, and can be used in schools for teachers, etc. Also, if you want any assistance from our trauma team or any of OHEL services, these are the numbers and the link in which you can reach us. Again, I have like 2 minutes left, so let me see if I can get through the chats. Actually, this worked out pretty well in terms of timing. I'm usually worse. Okay, my son sends me strength when I'm feeling grief for him. I know he wouldn't want me crying, but to stay strong. Yes, they want that. In fact, that's one of the most touching stories, remember, was a not even 4-year-old yet. There was close to 4-year-old boy who was dying, and his last message to his parents and siblings before he lapsed into a coma was, don't be sad, be happy like me. That's what they want. When does grief become complicated grief? I had a client who would be in extreme distress if she did not visit his grave every day. If it's compulsive, if it's developed into something, and I would check with someone like that if they have OCD tendencies, yes, then that's not helpful. If it's truly, it's not their nature, but it's truly comforting for them, yeah, then they're doing the right thing for them, and you can't question it. I've adopted the Mexican tradition of creating an altar during Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, to celebrate their life with photos and items representing life. Yes, beautiful, and you'll find many cultures have these kind of commemorations. Emily, do I have to stop or should I go through the rest of the messages?
I think I just want to give people information about CU.
Okay, so okay, no problem.
Yeah,
okay.
but thank you so much,
Okay,
Dr.
my pleasure.
Blumenthal.
Okay,
That was
thank you.
a beautiful presentation. So for everyone who's on, please don't leave. If you are a social worker, a licensed mental health counselor, or a certified art therapist, in the chat box, hold on, for you to fill out a form for us. And the form is your application to get your CEUs. We will also be emailing out this form to everyone. But please, if you have time, fill it out now. We will keep the room open for a couple of minutes. If you have any questions about CEUs, etc., I'm putting that the email in the chat box for that too. And if you have any questions about the presentation, it's the same email. It's ceus@cbcare.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this presentation. Thank you so much again, Dr. Blumenthal, for your wonderful presentation. And if you are having trouble with the form, we will be sending it out via email as well. So sorry the form is not working. I'm not sure why, but we'll be sending it out via email. I apologize to everyone. There is a recording that we will be sending out on the CBC website as well, and we'll send the link to that. So we have all of your information, and those who attended the full training will be the ones who get CEU credits. But that was amazing, Dr. Blumenthal. And I also want to thank Tara Reddy, who has been doing our admin behind the scenes. Just watching the chats. If you have any questions about CEUs, again, please send it to ceus@cbcare.org. And any questions about the presentation, we will field all your questions.
And please feel free to contact me as well if there are any issues.
Yeah. We will get we will get questions to you, Dr. Blumenthal.
Sure. Okay. My pleasure.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So thanks everyone for being
thank you, Emily.
And we're going to leave the chat, the room open for a couple minutes, but Dr. Blumenthal, you don't have to stay. I'm just going to field any questions.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, Dr. Blumenthal.
My pleasure. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
And thanks to everyone for your wonderful participation.